Hello everyone and welcome to today's information webinar from our series in preventing musculoskeletal disorders, the role of manual handling training in preventing MSDs. Today's session is presented to you by SafeWork SA in collaboration with Return to Work SA. Before we start, some housekeeping. So today there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the webinar. Please use the Q&A function if it's available, which is a button at the top of your screen. This is a little bit different to a chat function, which you're free to use throughout the webinar if you'd like to discuss topics amongst yourselves. But the Q&A function is the best place to ask your questions of the panel. There will be some opportunity for audience participation today, so please have your phones handy and ready to scan some QR codes. There will also be a survey at the end of the webinar, and we kindly ask that you provide some feedback for the team. We also have a Slido poll, which is an opportunity for you to have your say and to give some feedback to the panel on some questions that we're going to ask you early on. So if you could have that ready pretty soon, that would be very handy. Thank you. Firstly, on behalf of our panel, I would like to acknowledge the land that we meet on and present to you today from is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide region, and their culture and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. Now, to introduce the panel to you for today, we have Heidi Turbill, Team Leader of the Work Environment Unit, and she is a certified professional ergonomist and a registered occupational therapist with over 30 years of industry experience. Welcome, Heidi.
Thanks, David.
We also have with us Alex Anaf from Return to Work SA. Alex is a qualified physiotherapist who works as an injury risk consultant. Thanks for being with us today, Alex.
Thanks, David.
My name is David Knight. I'll be your host. I'm an education and engagement advisor here at SafeWork SA. So there's a lot to cover today. We're going to take a deep dive into the role of training in preventing MSDs. And this will be done through a few different lenses. First, we're going to conduct a quick poll to see what you, the audience, is experiencing and already doing in the training space. Next, we're going to discuss some common misconceptions about the role of training and whether or not its place in risk management is being misunderstood. We're going to take a look at the Heads of Workplace Safety Authority's position statement on what is termed how to lift training. And we'll look at the evidence base for how to lift training within a risk management system. Heidi will cover what the regulations say about training, and then we're going to look at some of the educational resources and other opportunities to help manage musculoskeletal disorders and hazardous manual tasks risks. So, without any further ado, we'd like to ask you a question, you the audience. If you could kindly take out your mobile device and scan the QR code, the question being, or the statement being, lifting technique or how to lift training is used in my workplace. And the options are yes, through videos and posters on how to lift correctly. Yes, through stretching exercises before work. Or no, we don't use this type of training. So feel free to join in. I'll jump to the next slide in a moment and we'll have a live result. We'll show you live results of your results. So here we go. It's coming through now. Give it a few moments to continue to update. So very interesting. We've got around just over half or just under 3/4 saying yes, we have videos and posters on how to lift correctly. Around 1/4 saying no, we don't use this type of training at this stage. About 10% with yes through stretching exercises before work. We're nearly up to 70 respondents here. I'll leave it for just another moment. But it seems to be fairly consistent. We're sort of looking at a just under 3/4 and just around a quarter, and then around 10%. It looks like about 1/3 don't use that type of training, and 2/3 use some form of it. The next statement is lifting technique is necessary under WHS legislations. And the options here are disagree, agree, or neutral. So lifting technique is necessary under WHS legislation. So we'll wait until we get around about the same number of participants responding to this one as well. So again, we've hit about just shy of 70 respondents now, or just on 70 now. And it looks like around about 3/4-ish agree, around a quarter disagree, with a few people undecided. So that's an interesting, I suppose, look and a bit of a snapshot at what do we think about these statements, and do we think it's necessary under the legislation? Thank you for participating, and hopefully we'll be able to come back to those statements later. And if you do have any questions about them, please feel free to use the Q&A function as we go along. So really, why are we here? Well, you heard last week that data suggests that despite the best efforts to prevent MSDs, injury claim data remains stubbornly high. It seems it is a lot harder than we realised to put an end to the high numbers of body stress in claims, and that's those statistics were shared with us last week by Alex from Return to Work. Today, we're going to ask you to consider why that might be the case. You will hear from the panel about some common misconceptions about the role of training in managing MSDs, and how we could potentially reframe our approach to risk management to get better outcomes. Our panel, through their work with employers, commonly hear things like, we train all of our employees as part of our hazardous manual task control measures. We use lifting techniques training, and also many people conducting business believe that this technique training is a requirement under WHS law. So today's session will challenge everyone here to aim for higher order controls and work design to ultimately see if we can start to reduce the number of injuries resulting from hazardous manual tasks at work. To understand just how significant the shift in thinking has come over the last few decades, there's no better place to start than the Hauser position statement released in 2022. That's the heads of workplace safety authorities, which is all of the WHS regulators across Australia and New Zealand. And they released a position statement about how to lift training, with the aim being to reduce reliance on how to lift training as a means of controlling hazardous manual tasks, related hazards, and to inform business and industry of how hazardous manual tasks should be managed. And it also aimed to state the way that WHS regulators will consider the compliance status of how to lift training in relation to employer duties to manage risk associated with hazardous manual tasks. So to sum up, the paper describes what the regulators deem necessary to comply with WHS law in relation to hazardous manual task risk management and suitable training. So it's a fairly important statement, and if you are unaware, now is a good time to scan the code and save it for later. It can also be found on our website. Heidi, I was wondering if you might clarify how to lift training and what is and isn't how to lift training.
Yeah, thanks, David. Certainly, I'm delighted to cover that. I think it's really important to understand the messaging of what Hauser are talking about here when they're talking about how to lift training. So commonly, I think in industry, they would view this as lifting technique training. So it's that common approach that you've probably seen, such as the posters that we can see here on the screen, where it's really focusing on the technique of bending your knees, keeping your back straight, or using a neutral spine position. It could be talking about using a power stance when you're going to be lifting something, maybe about, bracing your abdominal or your core muscles when you're doing those types of movements. It might also cover some warm-up exercises or stretches that could be used to, I suppose, prevent injury. And I suppose overall, it's uses generic principles and generic messaging around using the correct posture and maybe not to be lifting things that are too heavy for individuals. If we go on to the next slide, I suppose in contrast to that, what how to lift training, as referred to in this document, is not referring to is that it's not talking about the risk management principles and approach to manage hazardous manual task risks. It's not talking about the risk factors that are associated with hazardous manual tasks or the control measures that would be implemented to reduce those risks and address the hazards, such as using mechanical aids or redesigning the work environment. So it's really important to understand that it's really focusing on the worker's behaviour and the worker changing the way they're moving their body, as opposed to addressing, I suppose, the hazards and the risk management approach to manage hazardous manual task risks.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting. About worker behaviour versus managing the risks themselves. Heidi, can you give us an idea about what research is saying about this type of training?
Yeah, sure. So look, over really decades, there's been a ton of research that's been conducted about how to reduce work-related musculoskeletal disorders. There's been, an array of lots of different interventions that have been analysed and looked at, and some of them might relate to implementing maybe equipment in the workplace or design elements, and some of it also includes looking at stretching programs and technique training, or this how to lift training approach. And probably in the last 15 years or so, there's been some what we call meta-analyses or systematic reviews of all of that research that has been done, and it's really ranked the quality of that research. And so I've listed a few of the articles in the slide here, but what consistently has been found is that this lifting technique training, or how to lift training as Hauser have determined it, is not effective in preventing work-related musculoskeletal disorders. If we just go to the next slide, the other thing that a lot of the research has really shown over the years, and we touched on this a little bit last week in our webinar, are some of the causal pathways that relate to musculoskeletal disorders. So we know there are certainly physical and psychosocial hazards that affect the incidence or risk of musculoskeletal disorders, and we've kind of represented that in this slide here. So just for those of you who maybe hadn't attended our webinar last week, I thought I would take the time just to briefly talk through this now so that we understand what we're talking about in this research. So starting over on the left, we're kind of looking at all the elements of how work is designed and the factors that can influence musculoskeletal disorders. So they could range from the design of the work, the layout within the workplace, that those things could affect how far people need to carry loads, or the heights or reaches that people need to perform to conduct work. It also looks at the number of times that people might need to lift or handle something. It might look at the nature or the shape of those things that are handled. And then we also look at the environmental conditions, and also the way that work is designed in terms of the system of work, the workflows, the way work is managed, and so on. So these 4 different key areas present both physical and psychosocial stresses. Now, they impact the body in two different ways. So from that physical nature, they really look at the load, the physical load or the compression that is placed on the muscles, joints, bones, etc. Of our body, and that can cause a degree of tissue damage, or the tissue isn't able to recover from that load over time, and it also reduces what we call the tissue's tolerance to withstand that mechanical load as well. From the psychosocial element, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with that term now, is that we also see when people are feeling overwhelmed by their work, or feeling that the conditions of the work are challenging from what they can really bring to the party, we see a stress response occurring in the body, where hormones, and different chemicals are released into our body, and those hormones themselves have an impact on these musculoskeletal tissues in our body. So we might see, as we can see below, that there might be slightly reduced blood flow going to certain tissues in our body. We might see that there's a reduced ability for tissue that might have very microscopic levels of damage, their ability to heal. We might see localized swelling, and we could also see inflammation of tendons that are occurring. So these two very different pathways ultimately relate to cumulative tissue damage over a period of time, pain, sensitization, and musculoskeletal injury. In terms of when we're talking about lifting technique training, though, what it doesn't show is that changing someone's behaviour in how they move is going to actually impact any of these causal pathways for musculoskeletal disorders.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, Heidi. So, I mean, teaching someone how to lift may not change the design and layout of the work area. It's not going to change the nature or size or weight or number of things handled. So that does make plenty of sense. I'm sure some people are probably also thinking to themselves, but there must be some small benefit still of handling things with having a good technique for handling things. So I'm sure we'll discuss what the aims of the training should really be more focused on in a moment. And thank you for sharing the model again with us, because I know that's very important, and it's good to know that it's important to know that there are more, complex causal pathways to musculoskeletal disorders. I was wondering, Alex, if you could join in with us now and elaborate on what outcomes training should be aiming for, if not behavioural change.
Yeah, thanks, David. And look, I think that for me, one of the key points here that Heidi mentioned is around the fact that if you're relying on behaviour change and people and workers changing what they do and their behaviour as your primary control measure, then you're really not doing anything to address why the problem is there in the first place. Behaviour change is so tricky and such a complex thing as well. So I think what's going to motivate somebody and encourage them to perhaps work in what we would deem a safe way or a correct way is inherently going to give us a variable outcome, because everybody's different. So what works for one person is going to be different for the next. So I think there's some challenges right off the bat around relying too heavily on worker behaviour. In terms of how to lift training, I think the other element here is that people's movement patterns are pretty well ingrained, and you'll know that within yourselves if you go for a walk with somebody and they walk at a different pace to you. Trying to change your cadence and your speed to keep up with them or to slow down for them can be pretty annoying at the best of times. So expecting people to be able to change the way they move while in a real life work situation where they've got some complex tasks perhaps that they need to be completing as well, and they're thinking about 101 other things, I think, we're struggling there to get that to be really effective on a consistent basis. I think also typically there'll be workplace factors and personal factors that are going to challenge people here. So, and that ties in partly to the systems of work stuff. So there could be things in place in a workplace around, it might be piece rate pay, where people are paid more if they complete more of a task. So there's an encouragement to perhaps work faster and to get things done and maybe push safety to the side a little bit to achieve that. We often hear that managers will have bonuses tied to output. So the more that their staff can do, the better it is for them. So there's a bit of a conflict potentially there around what the messaging needs to be. and that's working against people's behaviour. The culture within a workplace can be a huge factor for this as well. If the safety culture within an organisation isn't as strong or as robust as it should be, then perhaps people won't be as inclined to put their hand up and say, hey, I'm struggling here, or I didn't get that. Sorry, my light's going to play tricks with me again. So I think there's some things there which are going to be, as I said, working against us if we rely too heavily on behaviour change. And the other element to that is people's own beliefs. So in my consultancy, what I've heard a lot over the years is people saying, I don't really think I need to change because I've never had an injury. And look, that might be right. At an individual level, that might be right. But I think at a higher level, that's a bit fraught with danger. And I sometimes think to myself, that's a little bit akin to wanting to throw out the fire extinguishers because we've never had a fire. So I think that behaviour is so complex. So I think relying too much on that is going to be a challenge for us. There's some other factors, and Heidi mentioned this in the causation model that we saw just a moment ago, that really, if we want to make good headway into preventing musculoskeletal disorders from hazardous manual tasks, we really need to be dealing with what's the problem in the first place. So what are those hazards and those risk profiles? And what lifting technique training doesn't do is deal with those sources of risk. So there might be the design and the layout of the work area could be what is ultimately the problem. So if we think about a lifting task, that could be people having to bend over and reach into a large tub or bin to pull items out. So they might have training to say, keep a neutral spine and bend your knees, but the environment isn't actually conducive to that. The systems of work, I think, is a really big one. I've seen before, you might have a policy, if we think of perhaps an aged care environment or a healthcare environment, where a decision might be made that for a bariatric patient, you need a certain number of people to be involved to provide the best level of care. Yet on a night shift, there might not be that many people rostered on. So how do you do that? How do you navigate that in the heat of the moment? Or it might be that all our deliveries get done on a Monday. So we've got a week's worth of stock that we need to put away when perhaps it could have been spread out a little bit more through the week. So those system factors of work, I think, are a really crucial part to this. As Heidi said, we've got physical but also psychosocial factors, and I think there's a lot of good evidence out there now for that. So perhaps thinking about the body alone is perhaps a little bit too simplistic nowadays. So I think we need to think a little bit broader in that regard. And environmental conditions can be a really big factor of musculoskeletal risk of injury. So that might be weather conditions, it could be the floor surface, it could be the time of the day may impact that a little bit as well. So that's something we need to be thinking about. And also, what's the load? If we talk broadly, what's the load that's needing to be potentially handled if it is a manual task in that regard? So then factors like, well, how clean is that load? How awkward is the shape of it? And those sorts of factors really come into play as well. So you can see that there's a lot of different sources where the actual hazard might stem from, that as an organisation, if we want to really move forward with improving the safety of those tasks for the entire workforce, we have to go to that root cause level and not rely too heavily on hoping that people move in what we might consider to be a more ideal way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, and thank you for sharing that research as well. Heidi, what can you tell us about this particular survey?
Yeah, so in 2021, researchers out of the La Trobe University, and these researchers are some of the formative leaders in the area looking at the linkage between psychosocial hazards and musculoskeletal disorders. They surveyed work health and safety professionals and providers of what would be considered manual handling training or lifting technique training across Australia. And what was really, I suppose, concerning to us was that still, despite the fact that we've had messaging that has gone out around the ineffectiveness of training and the need to change the design of the work, that still almost 70% of employers had provided how to lift training to their workers in the past 2 years. They also thought that how to lift training, as we had done a poll earlier in this webinar, looked at, they thought that it was a requirement of work health and safety legislation. And the other point that was quite interesting were, if you were a provider of how to lift training, the providers even had the view that even if they thought that the how to lift training wouldn't be effective in helping the employer to manage their hazardous manual task risks, they would still just go about delivering the training anyway. So they might have viewed that it would not make that much of an impact. So it's concerning from our view that it's really commonplace in industry, and that people actually think that it is a requirement under the work health and safety laws.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting that, and it's difficult to change when you've got both providers of training still promoting and still, I guess, reinforcing the idea that maybe it's necessary, it's mandatory even, and yet, research and data is suggesting otherwise. And interestingly, Heidi, did you, I'm not sure if you took note of or if you wrote down the poll results, but I did, and this survey that you're showing us now was around 70% provided how to lift. We had around 65% in the survey of our participants here today, plus around 10% who said yes through posters and the like, and around about 70% as well, or 2/3 thereabouts, around agreeing that how to lift training is a requirement in the law. So very interesting to sort of look at that comparison and to all be a part of that little experiment.
Yeah.
Just looking at the Hauser position statement again.
Yeah, sure. I think just the other point I'll add to that previous slide is that certainly we've seen instances in an incident investigation that might have been conducted at a workplace where there's been somebody that sustained a musculoskeletal disorder injury, is that quite often the findings of that investigation often will directly state, the worker used poor lifting technique in doing this task, and the outcome is for that employee to go through further training and learn how to do the trials. And I suppose it's a missed opportunity to really be looking at the work and looking at what is it actually the potential causative factors from the design of the work that the work has been asked to do that is the problem, as opposed to really almost trying to point the finger at the worker and finding fault in the way that they conducted themselves and moved their body in doing that task. So what the Hauser position statement goes on to say is really making a very clear message in terms of what is required to manage the risks of hazardous manual tasks. It talks that there is obviously a need to use the risk management approach, which I know we would all be aware of here, but really that focus needs to be on those higher level control measures being in place, the elimination, the substitution and the engineering controls to really focus on those sources of the risk. It also spells out that the risk management approach needs to involve consulting with other duty holders who understandably include workers in managing those risks, and that the information and training that's provided to workers needs to be suitable and adequate to be in line with the legislation. If you look at the Code of Practice, and we will dive into this a little bit more, it does actually spell out what is suitable and adequate training in the Hazardous Manual Task Code of Practice. But we just wanted to make a clear message here is that how to lift training, or this technique training approach, is not considered suitable or adequate training to protect workers from the risks of musculoskeletal disorders.
Yeah, super interesting. And certainly if you haven't checked out that Hauser statement, please find it on our website or back to the QR. So Heidi, with all that in mind, what is suitable and adequate training? in the eyes of the regulator and the Hauser committee?
Yeah. So if you've not looked at the hazardous manual task code of practice, obviously it is available at our website, and it's full of lots of useful information. Section 4, Part 10 talks about implementing control measures, and there's a specific section there on training, and it goes into this in detail. But fundamentally, it talks about that training needs to cover the manual task risk management approach, looking at the characteristics of the work that relates to your workplace. It needs to look at the specific manual task risks and the control measures that are in place to manage those risks. It will also need to look at covering how to perform manual tasks safely by looking at, the use of mechanical aids, tools or equipment, and the safe work procedures that are in place to perform that task. And I suppose, notably, safe work procedures does not mean lifting technique training. And lastly, it focuses on how to report a problem, a concern. It could be a maintenance issue. There could be, some sort of hazard that you're wanting to report, that workers know how to report those issues to their workers. So that is spelled out quite clearly, and can go through, you can look at that in the code of practice.
Yeah, so I guess it's fairly clear then that, training alone, it's not really considered a control measure as a standalone option. So before we move on to this slide, I just want to remind everyone we do have, and we are encouraging your questions today using the Q&A function, which you can access through the button at the top of your screen. It says Q&A. And yeah, please do pop your questions in there. I'm sure people are starting, this probably is generating some questions around, what's been done in the past and where to from here. So, okay, so we're looking at training process. So if we are going to implement training, broadly speaking, what should we think about beforehand when planning this? I might throw this to you, Alex, as a physio.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David. And I think, really want to echo what Heidi mentioned and yourself, David, around training being part of a broader strategy here and looking at some of those higher level controls to complement it. But there is a role for training. There is a place for it. So we need to be thinking around who actually needs the training. And I think putting a risk lens on that can be quite useful to work out what different tasks are people doing, what different roles do you have in your organisation, and who will this benefit? And is it a one-size-fits-all thing, or do we need to tailor what we do to suit different people in the workforce a little bit better? Also, who provides the training? So is it someone that has the right qualifications and the right experience? So, that might sound perhaps a little obvious, but I think that does slip through the cracks sometimes from what I've seen. And also, can the people that are going to receive the training, can they relate to the person delivering it? I can think of times where you might have, potentially some real heavy, manual, dirty kind of work that's happening. And if a trainer was to come in a very crisp suit and tie and stand with their laptop and briefcase, are they really connecting? Is it going to be well received? So just thinking about those sorts of factors, I think will get you off to a good start to begin with. The dosage of training, if I can call it that, is an important thing to give some consideration to as well. So how often are we going to provide training? How frequently is that going to be done? I think sometimes training gets seen a little bit like perhaps your flu vax. Like, I'll turn up once a year, I'll get my dose, and then I'll leave and not think about it again. So is that really going to be effective for your organisation and the people within it? Or do we need to break that down a little bit and think about perhaps offering things more often, or shorter sessions or longer sessions? So just play with those different variables to see what might be the best fit for the organisation. I think around relevance is a huge part of training. And I think adult learning in general, it has to be relevant. So do people that perform one task or function, do they need to be trained in other tasks that they never perform? Probably not. So I think sometimes that blanket approach can trip us up from the beginning, because we're missing that point of relevance. And then on that, we really need to be considering the actual environment of the training if you are going to be running it. So how closely does it match the environment that people are going to be working in? If you've got equipment that you're going to teach people how to use, does it actually match the equipment that those workers are going to use in their workplace? Or is it something different, and therefore that relevance becomes a problem again? So the closer you can match those types of things, I think the more successful it's going to be. And then, as we said at the start, training being part of a broader system or a broader approach to risk management in this space. So are we thinking about the other variables that we spoke of earlier, and have we implemented some higher order controls? So then if we think about when do we review what training we deliver, that should be quite frequent, rather than we've designed a training package and we've rolled it out the same and it's never been changed in the last however long. The processes might have changed, the environment might have changed, the equipment might have changed, the products might have changed. So we really need to be reflecting on that and tailoring the approach to keep it as close a match to the real world as we possibly can. From an employer perspective, then keeping records, I think, is really important as well, and something that perhaps gets missed in our busy lives. So capturing who attended, what was covered, what were any issues that came up, and is there a feedback loop in there that if people do raise an issue through training about a broader work issue, is there a way to tackle that? So it's great, potentially to tell the trainer that, hey, this is great information, but all of our equipment's broken. That's great to flag that, but actually is the trainer the right person to be flagging that with, or is there a system problem there that's highlighted where actually the people that could fix it aren't in the loop? So some of those things need to be considered as well.
Yeah, thanks, Alec.
And if we look at this in practice a little bit, we thought we'd come up with a couple of scenarios and try and step through what this might actually look like in, admittedly, a little bit of an expedited process, but hopefully to illuminate how this fits together. So if we take the first example here, and we've decided that lifting patients or clients in a healthcare setting is something that's been identified as a hazardous manual task. So we've identified that there's a task that we want to implement some training around. Really what we need to do in that process is work out what is it about that task that's actually hazardous. So that risk and hazard identification piece becomes really crucial up front. And in this example, what we've identified is that there's potentially quite a high level of force that's needed for workers to complete the task, and that they might be in some awkward or potentially some sustained postures, which could become problematic for them. So from that identification, we've come up with some control measures, and these are some higher level control measures that we've identified here, some engineering controls. So we've got height adjustable beds, we might have some mobile or floor lifters, we might have a ceiling hoist if we're lucky, there could be slide sheets that are available for people to use, or other pieces of equipment like that. So the training then is really going to be around, this is what the actual hazard is. This is what we've identified as being problematic. These are some of the control measures that are available. This is where you find them. This is how you use it in a safe manner. Really importantly, this is how you identify if it's going to actually, if there's a problem with the piece of equipment, what do you do about it? Like I mentioned before. So that's a really crucial piece of that training package, because you could have the best ceiling lifter in the world, but if it's not working, it's not really worth much. Okay, so that maintenance piece, but also what's the limitation of the control measure? So when wouldn't it be suitable to be used? I think is a really crucial thing that would need to be covered if you wanted that training to be as successful as possible. Otherwise, you run the risk of people using it, and they might use it correctly, but they're not using it at the right time, and therefore it's not effective. And the real big piece down the bottom of the slide there that I think needs to underpin all of this is consultation. And this is, I think, a part that we can all reflect on and probably try and optimize this at every opportunity, because without the consultation piece, you run the risk of not actually identifying what are the parts of someone's job that actually are problematic. What are the problems associated with it? So the hazard identification piece falls into question there. But working with the people doing the task to come up with what those control measures and solutions might look like. It's a really powerful way to improve the safety culture, but also to increase adherence to the use of that control measure, if the people using it got to choose what it was as well. And then was it effective? Did people walk away from it feeling like this has actually helped, or has it made it more tricky and potentially complicated things further? But we don't know that because we're not asking those questions.
Exactly. There's lots of research that points to, people's involvement in things as being the driving factor between whether or not they feel invested and they feel, empowered and want to be a part of something. It's how much say do they have in the process. I find that really interesting that you said that the training itself in this model, in this particular example, the training is around learning the control measures rather than the training being the control measure. So that's really interesting. Being trained to use the control measures.
Lovely way to summarise that, David. Yeah. You're far more eloquent than me. That's a perfect way to capture that in a nutshell.
Too kind, Alex. What about this example? And I do love examples because I think we all want to see things as tangible, kind of. We can visualize it, we can imagine it. What about this one here?
Yeah, so again, trying to pick something that we see in industry a fair bit of. So if we take this example being needing to push a fairly sizable trolley, perhaps through a production facility or something of that nature. So again, that identification, what's actually the problem here? So by looking at that task and identifying then, okay, perhaps it is that it's quite heavy. So there's a fair bit of force needed there. A really common problem with tall trolleys is a lack of visibility. So someone might be pushing it from one end, but they can't see what's in front of them. What that can do, other than run the risk of banging into something or someone, is people tend to use these really funny and awkward postures to bend and lean to see around the front of what they're pushing, when it's a kind of an equipment issue to begin with, but that's the way we adapt. So the control measures that might come up from something like that is looking at, well, if it's a force issue, can we get something like a trolley mover or a powered tug type product to take the force away? Do we need an administrative control? So yes, lower order, but perhaps effective in this case to have two people available to do the task so that someone can be a spotter at the front of the trolley to allow someone to then use a better position while they're doing the task. Do we need some floor markings to take away the risk of some sort of accident of banging into something that we didn't know was there, or people putting stock within a walkway that's the trolley might hit or bang into? Do we need to look at the actual design of the trolley itself and get different ones? Or do we need to look at that system of work factor and go, why are we moving so much stuff on a trolley in the first place? Is there a way to change the process here? But again, as you so beautifully said, David, the training around those things is then, where do you find whatever the solution is? How do you attach it? How do you know which buttons to press? If it's not working or it hasn't been charged, if we had a tug, then what do you do? What's the solution in that type of problem solving or troubleshooting situation? So the training isn't the solution in itself, as you said. And there can be other issues that come in this type of example, as we said, around the systems of work. So why is it all being produced on one day or at one time? Are staff available? When are they needed? We might have a lovely trolley mover, but it's not actually compatible with all the trolleys in the facility. So how do you know that? How do you identify that and solve that before someone hurts themselves? And that's where that consultation piece again underpins all of this, because it's the workers that will tell you pretty quickly that that's a great trolley mover, but it doesn't work with that trolley and that trolley and that trolley. Or it doesn't work on a Monday if we get this stock delivered because the stock moves around too much on the trolley and it's too slippery. So we have to do that consultation piece if we want our controls to be as effective as possible.
Yeah, and the workers need to feel safe to share their feelings and knowledge around that.
Absolutely.
And then unfettered or in a safe sort of manner. I see you have a third example for us here, and I like this one. So because it's sedentary work, which we often think of as being far less hazardous, and there'll be no injuries in sitting at our desk.
If only that was true, David. I think we've got the research and the data to know that sedentary work has a whole can of worms associated with it. But we may not think of training when it comes to sedentary work. I think historically we would think of training when it's something more effortful, and that might be where a control needs to go in. But absolutely, sedentary work can be a real minefield for musculoskeletal disorders. And that identification piece would show us it's those sustained postures, potentially really awkward postures if our setup isn't optimal, that will be, probably one of the main drivers of an injury being sustained. So control measures, and again, the same point that we're reiterating here, the training will centre around how you use the control. It might be sit-stand desks, it might be a more adjustable, or we might term it an ergonomic type of chair. We might have some system changes where we say, all right, we're going to do these sorts of tasks in a different location to promote some movement and to get us away from our desk. Maybe an environment change where we can create some collaboration zones so that people don't feel glued to their desk for their entire work day. And then that training piece is around, this is how you use the equipment, this is how you let us know if it's not working for you. If we need something else, this is the person that you can go and talk to. And that's where it would stem from and really revolve around. And that reporting piece becomes crucial, as I mentioned, because like we said before, if we don't have the solution or the control working optimally, then it's not really of much value. And what we don't always know is whether or not we're going to have some, side effects from implementing control measures that we weren't able to really see ahead and think that they were going to come up. So that consultation piece to go, is everything working? Do you need something else? And hey, we want to look after you, can be a really nice message from an overall safety culture perspective.
Yeah, well said. Really like those examples, and thank you for bringing those along, because I think it's important to see more and to think about things in real life situations. So we just want to quickly highlight now some of the new guidance material that's on our website. Heidi, can you take us through what's been added in the recent, in the last week or two or three?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did touch on this a little more in last week's webinar, but we have, redesigned and built a whole new range of resources around looking at hazardous manual tasks. So this is a screenshot of the, the landing page for hazardous manual tasks on the SafeWork SA website. The QR code can take you there, and I think we've popped a link in the chat function that can take you straight to that landing page. So we have, we've got a full overview of everything that's required to look at addressing hazardous manual task risk management, looking at the different duty holders' responsibilities, the causation model of musculoskeletal disorders, and particularly we've got, you can see that tile there on training, which has all the information that we've covered today, including the Hauser position statement and some other resources. So, David, if you want to flick over to the next slide, I'll feature and discuss a little bit one of the key training resources that relates to exactly what we're talking about here today. We've designed a training fact sheet, which really summarises and gives you as an employer just a really good summary of exactly what you need to do in reviewing your own training approach that you have in place if you already have a training or approach. Or if you don't, we did note some people perhaps were maybe saying that they might not have a specific training approach in place at the moment. Where to start in thinking about what you need to put in place and what needs to be included in that training. So the fact sheet goes a little bit through the how's a position statement and has a link to it, and also some frequently asked questions that are, I suppose, commonly asked around this area. And it really is going to be useful if you're looking at your existing training information, and it might help to highlight where you can make some improvements to bring it in line with what we would consider that suitable and adequate. I suppose also from our point of view, this checklist could be used from a business's perspective. It could also be used from a provider's perspective as well. So if you are a provider or you're engaging a provider, you could ask them in, providing them a quotation to provide some training around hazardous manual tasks to, detail what they will actually be including in that training, so that you can feel comfortable that they're providing something that would be in line with what we've discussed here today. Also, I think, if I was a provider who was going to be walking into a business and providing some training, I would actually want the business to provide me some information on what are, some of the hazardous manual tasks that you'd like to specifically be addressed. What are some of the key risk factors, and what are your control measures that you have in place that workers can use, so that you can make sure that the training that's provided is specific, it's task specific, it's covering up on that risk management process. And, we're going to be discussing in a very practical way what the control measures are in place. As a business, if you're not giving that type of information to a provider, you might end up with a product or a service that's being delivered that is more generic in nature, and staff just aren't going to get as much out of it in the first place. So really, that take-home message, if you are an employer who's providing your own in-house training, you can use this checklist. But if you are engaging a provider, it can be beneficial on both sides in terms of checking what will be covered, but also it's that sharing of information so that you're going to get a really good product and something that's suitable and meaningful to workers.
Yeah, sounds like a great idea to try to work with your training provider to get something more tailored.
That's right. So lastly, on the website, there is also a resources tile. And just to quickly promote, going back to that identification of whether you have hazardous manual tasks in the first place in your business, we have an identification tool. We've also got a discomfort survey, which is another tool that you can use that helps to identify what could be hazardous. We've also got a risk assessment and control worksheet as well, and I suppose a systems audit that you can use. And we'll be going through these tools and how to use them more in some workshops that we'll be talking about in just a little bit more time. But there are a range of other tools that can help you form what are the tools and what are the things that that need training on in your workplace.
Thanks, Heidi. And brings us towards the final stages. So what are the key takeaways from today?
Yeah, so I hope we've emphasised enough in the training here that aspect of how to lift training, or think of it as that lifting technique training, is of itself not an effective control measure for looking at hazardous manual tasks. So from a compliance viewpoint, looking at trying to prevent musculoskeletal disorders that are caused through hazardous manual tasks, we're really wanting that risk management approach to be addressing the sources of the risk that can involve changing the work environment, or changing the exposure of workers to the hazards. And so the training that will get provided in that space really needs to be task specific. It needs to look at the characteristics of the work that are hazardous, the control measures that are in place, and obviously, as we talked about, how to report issues and that engagement of staff along the way there. I think probably what's most important to say is that we're not saying that if you're currently using technique, we're not saying that it's bad. We're just saying that it is ineffective in preventing musculoskeletal disorders, and that if we're coming to your workplace, we would want to have evidence that you're doing other things to be managing the risk above just providing this type of training. So I hope that message is clear to the audience who's attended today.
So you're saying that if an PCBU was to show you that they had trained workers in how to lift training, that an inspector may form the reasonable belief that there wasn't an effective way of managing hazardous, or that they hadn't followed a risk management procedure entirely for managing hazardous manual tasks?
Yeah, so we're saying if that's your only control measure, the only thing that you're doing, delivering technique training to staff, that would not be an effective control measure. So that might be a scenario that we would be looking to issue an improvement notice that would be focused around implementing control measures that would be effective to manage those risks of the work. So if you're maybe doing how to lift training in addition to some other higher order controls, designing the layout and everything, then we would be looking at those other controls that would be effective in managing those musculoskeletal disorder risks.
Yeah, primary control measures rather than the lower order.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Heidi. And I suppose this brings us to where to from here. So the work environment team, who you heard from last week, Heidi and Sharon Zageen, have been busy planning workshops which will commence in November. You can sign up using the QR code here. Heidi, can you give us any quick insights or scoops as to what will be happening in these workshops?
Absolutely. So we'll be running monthly webinars. So just to reiterate, these monthly webinars will be the same webinar repeated over and over again. So there's opportunities for people to attend a session when they're available to. And the first one will be on Wednesday, the 20th of November. We will have just a short break over the Christmas New Year period, but then they'll kick off again in February. And if you follow the QR code or the link that we've just put up in the chat function, you can see that we've put in a few other dates in February and March next year. So you can look into one of those. We're going to be really looking at covering the new tools and resources, and really go through in a case study format how you go about looking at implementing that risk management approach to addressing the hazardous manual task risks. So we'll be looking at what the obligations are, what that risk management process looks like using a real case study, and we'll actually be giving some examples of the tools that we have available on our website to show people how you can implement them in your own workplace.
Excellent. Thanks, Heidi. And was there a rough time frame? How much time will people need to put aside to come along to one of the workshops?
Yeah, so they're going to be 2.5 hours long. So as you can see, there'll be quite a comprehensive workshop. Excellent. We're running it in a real workshop style. So we're looking at audience participation and really working through some case studies. So you get a really good feel for how you would go through that process. So it's not just a short, quick overview. It really is an in-depth dive into how to go through that process.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And some of the research that was used in today's presentation can be found here on this particular slide. We've included all the papers that have been referenced, and these will be available on the recording and are included in the Hauser position statement. That brings us to the Q&A part of the session. What I will try to do here is just jump into the Q&A. Heidi, can you tell me if I'm still sharing the same slide?
Yes.
Perfect. Always afraid to alt-tab my way into oblivion. Okay, so the actual most recent question was only a couple of minutes ago. Is long-distance driving considered a hazardous manual task? So, for example, a worker drives 450 k's in a sedan-type vehicle. The company induction and training, set controls for journey management, mandatory check-ins, journey rest breaks, and suggested stretches. Are they missing anything? That might be one for you there, Alex, as a physio.
So straight off the bat, yes, it is a hazardous manual task. Quite a significant sustained posture to do that, to go 450 kilometres in a vehicle. So yes, to answer the first part of the question, we would deem that hazardous, potentially hazardous. In terms of controls, it sounds like there's actually some really nice strategies already being implemented in there that do try and address that sustained posture element. So if there's mandatory breaks and so on, that's a really nice way to do it, but be clear that your systems of work actually support that and allow that to happen. It's lovely in theory, but we all know time pressures can creep in, and suddenly that 10-minute rest break just isn't viable on a particular day. Sounds like a reasonably comprehensive set of controls there, but also just stepping it back from that and asking yourself, do we need to do this? Do we have to get in the car to go 450 kilometres to do a particular piece of work? Sometimes those sorts of methods are a bit of a hangover from before we had things like Teams and so on. So something just to reflect on. Also, from a wider safety perspective, things like network coverage. So how well do the phones work if you're 450 kilometres away from a particular place? Are there dead spots there? Because you can have things like mandatory check-ins and so on. But if there's a vehicle accident, if the car breaks down in the middle of nowhere, have you tested that you actually can get the help you need? That might be something worth looking at.
And yeah, thanks, Alex. I suppose what I would just add to that, having done a fair bit of work in the transport industry as well, is looking at, from an ergonomic perspective, the seating in the vehicle, the suspension in the vehicle itself. And, if we look at a lot of truck drivers and the like who travel, very long distances, we could look at to what degree is the seating maintained over a period of time. So a truck could be 10, 15, 20 years old. Has at any point anybody thought to change the seat or refresh the padding to look at addressing the whole body vibration or shock absorbency that the worker is subjected to? So vehicle selection, and I've even been involved in looking at vehicle fit in a selection process of looking at fleet vehicles, is also important to ensure not that you've got, a really tall worker per se who's, 6'5", and is squeezing into a very small little vehicle, where they will be cramped. So looking at that higher order control of the actual vehicle selection, and, a lot of companies might actually change out the sort of standard issue seating to actually improve the seating in a vehicle to make it more robust in addressing some of those whole body vibration risks.
Thanks for that. Thanks, guys. Another one here is about consultation. It says, consultation is fabulous. How do we approach the too many heads rule? I appreciate that, I believe RA, they're referring to risk assessment, involves prioritising these things, but I have found on occasions that there is an overwhelming amount of information to sort through from just the consultation process.
Yeah, look, I would really look for themes when you're looking at a lot of information. So quite often in reading through responses or hearing people's views, you might get a certain cluster of a few key messages that are being brought to you by workers. So I would focus probably my attention on those if you're seeing those certain clusters of information. There will always be a shorter person's view as to their issue of not being able to, reach a particular issue, or, someone else's particular views. But if you focus on, I suppose, the main themes and the risk to be inclusive of the most workers as possible, I think that will give you a good place to sort of start in addressing those issues, Simon.
You're just on mute, David. But I'd also just add, to echo Heidi's comments, I'd still say put the time in for that. I think as challenging as it might be, long term, it's probably going to be a quicker thing to spend the time on the consultation, because you'll get better information, which will direct your efforts more clearly. The control measures you put in will stand a better chance of being effective. So yes, appreciate that it can be, a really time-consuming thing to go through that process, but I think that time ultimately gets spent anyway. It's just where we spend it, and I'd argue that spending it up front with good consultation is worth it. And there's a lot of tools out there to help with that now, and some of which you could access through the SafeWork SA website to help with that consultation piece, or contact us and we could help with that.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I agree. And one small thing, if I may add, is, I think with consultation starting big and working your way to smaller, looking at just the biggest things first with very limited amounts of feedback of just a one type of response, rather than long detailed responses about micro problems or micro details, and then you can drill down on those later. But certainly asking big questions about big ticket items and getting a sense of a response to that first before getting into the nitty gritty is helpful. Richard asks if we're going to be sharing this week's and last week's slide deck. Richard, sorry, we actually won't be, but we will be sharing and uploading both presentations to our SafeWork SA's YouTube channel. So you will be able to access the slides there, but not in terms of a file copy. There are no more questions in the Q&A. I'll just have a quick look at the chat and see if there's any that have been left in here. Looks like Beck's done a great job of keeping up with all the bits, and there's no other questions there. So with no further ado, I would like to thank you all for your participation mainly today. It was great to see so many people responding to our questions and our comments. We hope you found the information useful and that you can take something away from today back to your workplace that promotes safety of everyone's, in the face of hazardous manual tasks in your workplace. A special thank you to Heidi from our work environment team and Alex from Return to Work SA. Don't forget, if you would like to find any more information, you can visit our website. Please don't forget to register for the workshop coming up in November, and repeat it again in February or March, whatever works best for you. And finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving us with some feedback from today's webinar, you can scan the QR code on your screen and follow the links. Thank you very much for joining us. We hope to see you at the next workshop.